As we continue our consideration of the theological context or theological dimensions of the book of Joshua, let's turn our attention to what may be one of the most sticky topics within the book of Joshua, and yet one which offers us some considerable insights if we wrestle with it. And that has to do with the topic of violence. As you can see, I'm suggesting several sub-questions to this topic. First, how are we to understand the accounts of widespread violence resulting from the forcible settlement, that is, invasion, of Israel in Canaan? Second, that is point B, are the reports of total annihilation of towns to be taken literally? And C, if so, if literal, was this policy necessary? Could God have done it some other way? And question D, how was God at work in these events? I invite you to consider each of these with me. That first subpoint question, then, how are we to understand the accounts of widespread violence? First, I believe the text itself, the book itself, requires that we understand the accounts of widespread violence in the light of the exceptions which the book also presents. Two kinds of exceptions that I have in mind. First, numerical exceptions. That is to say, irrespective of behavior of either the defenders or the invaders, that would be the Israelites, irrespective of behaviors, and the kind of behavior I have in mind there was whether or not the Israelites were honoring God or acting unfaithfully, those kinds. Irrespective of that, we must acknowledge that just in terms of data, of numbers, quantity of people, census, if you will, in terms of that, we have on the one hand these broad statements that God fulfilled everything and the land was at rest because there was no opposition. And yet we have these exceptions that say yet there were pockets of resistance. That requires us, in my estimation, to read the accounts of widespread violence, as in the question, the widespread violence as generalizations. It seems that what we have here is some stylistic expressions by which one who is writing in that time frame would routinely say, we wiped everyone out. I'm not denying that that's literally what it says. I'm just asking that and asking whether or not we do not need to take the entire book into consideration, which in basically the same breath says there were exceptions. So that drives me to the conclusion that the author meant us to understand to some level, to a certain level, that the statements of widespread violence were generalizations. That does not mean that no one was killed in them by any means. It just means that there seems to be a stylistic expression which evidently was part of the way that they would describe the invasion or the conquering of a region. Subpoint B under item A, a type of exception, has to do with the defection exceptions. And here we have in mind individuals such as Rahab or a small group, an individual group such as the Gibeonites. This lets us know that within the broad scope of the conquest, the writer knows that there were some people who were in effect exempted or protected for one reason or another. In the case of Rahab, because she became an ally by helping them. In the case of the Gibeonites, becoming an ally through deception. So these kinds of exceptions, whether numerical exceptions or defection, that is from the local residents joining forces with the Israelites, these let us know that the widespread violence should be taken as I understand it, as something of a stylistic device, the language of conquest. Arabic point 2, understanding these accounts of widespread violence in the light of Eastern clan relationships over against Western individualism. Here's what I have in mind up to this point. As I read this, read the account of Joshua. I read it helplessly, without apology and without escape from my own background, being trained and growing up in the environment influenced by Western individualism. This is where the individual within a community and society has particular and unique worth, and any broad brushstroke violence against a group is perceived as being in violation of what an individual in that group may deserve. In other words, some in the group may deserve harsh consequences, but should we not consider it on a case-by-case basis, accounting individually for each member of the group? Western individualism focuses attention on every last individual, whereas Middle Eastern and clan relationship of earlier eras would describe the fate of a group, either for good or ill, as something that befalls the entire group. So they would think of a family or a clan as suffering the same benefits or suffering the same disasters. The clan rises or the clan falls. It's entirely possible then that the language that's used here would have been recognized by people in that era as being, frankly, the only way you talk about large groups of people interacting with each other. Tribes coming into a territory and encountering groups of people residing in cities. You just describe how those two entities interact in terms of group interaction, not the fate of selected individuals drawn out from within each group. Does that mean there's no attention to individuals? Well, of course not. We have the account of Achan, that is one individual that had ramifications for a group, and he receives harm. We have Rahab, one individual, who incidentally blesses her family. And that's a little bit of that twist. Her family, it's not she as an individual, but actually her household is benefited, her group is benefited, but she as an individual receives attention within the story and benefit within the story. What's the sum total of this point? It's to suggest that our discomfort, understandable, our discomfort with broad brushstroke violence may say as much about how we are conditioned to think of misfortune or violence. That is to say, we're conditioned, whenever possible, to reduce it down to individuals and to think of the plight and so the deserving or non-deserving nature of that violence against individuals, rather than thinking in terms of tight group structure and that the group rises or falls as a group. So consequently, from a tight clan structure of the ancient world, I think we should acknowledge that this is how we should expect the welfare or the suffering of groups to be described. We would expect it to be described in terms of whole groups rising or falling. And if it were not done so, a person from these environments or from this time frame, if it were not written this way, they would think it's strange. They have written it as would be suitable for their worldview, their understanding of the tight relationship within groups. Does that mean that every member of the group did or did not suffer these either benefits or harms? Well, I think the ancients would, the people originating this would say, well, that's not really the issue. You're asking the wrong question. We don't concern ourselves so much with accounting for every single individual. We, in relating a story of this, or an event of this sort, it is our primary concern from our worldview to tell you how the groups interacted and what happened to them. You may not find that satisfying, trained as we are to think through the lens of Western individualism, but I invite you to consider it and give that some thought. Point number 3, understanding widespread violence, in the light of God's faithfulness, and you may first respond with consternation, what is there faithful about violence? Think of the rationale that God has given for Israel coming into this place. You'll recall on the one hand, he said repeatedly, it's not because you are such outstanding people or so strong. You are not. Frankly, you have been a pain in my neck. We would say through the account of the wilderness wanderings and even getting to Sinai, God is frustrated with them. These are not exemplary people. It is not their noble character that commends them. God has chosen them. He's going to work with them, with Israel, in spite of their stickiness and their thorniness. So it's not the superior ethics or quality of Israel. What's going on here? God is saying, I'm putting you in the land because the other people have run out of time. And principle in this is recalling what God said to Abraham back in Genesis 15:16. Genesis 15:16. This is where he said, eventually, Abraham, this land will be yours. Right now, the Amorites live here. Their sin, however, is not yet complete. We get the picture of a clock ticking, a clock of morality, a clock of mercy, frankly. God saying, in the time of Abraham, centuries before the conquest, God is saying, I'm watching these Amorites. They're really going the wrong direction. It's too early for me to pull the plug on their civilization, however. But when that time comes, you will be the next in line for this land. What we're suggesting then is that God's faithfulness consists of two sides. There are two sides to this, two dimensions to it. And this will be, in my mind, one of the largest theological insights or gifts of the book of Joshua. For God's faithfulness involves not only finding him consistent and following through on his promise to do good, but there is also God's faithfulness that says if people consistently misbehave, there will come a time when consequences, which he has likewise promised to follow, will be enacted and will materialize. You see, failure to do so would amount to unfaithfulness on the part of God. Now, please do not rush to the conclusion that there's no room for mercy in this. Oh, that's the beautiful exception. God, as we know from the revelation of his character in the Golden Calf Rebellion and evidenced across history, he is delighted, he is overjoyed when he doesn't have to follow through on the promises to punish. But do we imagine that God's willingness to wait and wait and wait for some small flicker of repentance, do we suppose that that is going to extend into infinity? If we suppose this, there's a few places of the Bible that clearly we have not read. We have not read of the flood. God has done this before. And as we'll see in a later slide, there are passages in the New Testament that show it's going to happen again. No, we need to reckon with the enormously foundational fact that God's character as faithful then has two branches. Faithful to do good to those who walk with him, and faithful to visit the consequences, the punishment, on those who persistently, and please underscore that, those who persistently resist God's long-suffering efforts to give them a second, a third, a 400th, a 500th chance to repent. The last point on this page, item 4, suggests that we need to understand the accounts of widespread violence on Israel's conquest. And we should really call it God's conquest, shouldn't we? For that's how it's presented. In the light of God's global aim, and sometimes this is known as the Missio Dei, the mission of God. What is his objective? This particular comment sheds light on the long-range objective of God, which has been in place, first intimated in Genesis 3:15, the Proto-Evangelion, when God says to the serpent that the offspring of the woman, of Eve, would crush his head albeit the serpent would crush, same verb is used there, the heel of her offspring. This is the first good news that eventually there will be the overwhelming, the overturning of evil. We understand through the fuller range of Scripture that this would begin as a blessing through Noah and then through Abraham, all nations blessed, through the Israelite nation, through the Davidic line, through a Messiah. Now, when we look at what's happening in this Joshua slice of the Missio Dei, this is no small piece of the grand puzzle. This is no small piece of the large strategy of eventually bringing a Messiah through the Israelite nation, a Messiah whose innocent death, atonement, and powerful resurrection would overwhelm the kingdom of darkness. Nothing less than reclaiming lost creation across all time is at stake here. If Israel can be prevented from becoming a nation and remaining faithful to God, if that can be derailed, then God's massive and eternal plan of reclaiming creation, whole of creation, is lost. This should be considered as we think about what God is doing, not just what Joshua is doing, but what God is doing in rescuing these people from Egypt, making them a people for himself, showing them how to live, beginning to reveal himself, his character, his promises, and his plans through these people, which we know then culminated in the Messiah. This should come into our focus as one of the components at work on the table at this slice of history, Israel being settled in a land. We should acknowledge that in and of itself does not exclusively answer or satisfy the question of the widespread violence. It just reminds us that what's going on in this slice of history is more than simply one nation moving into a piece of real estate. This is part of, it overlaps with the grand scheme of God. Another question that I have raised in relation to violence in Joshua is whether or not the total annihilation of towns is to be taken literally. To a degree, this has already been answered. At least some information has been shared with concerning this, with regard to the acknowledgement that we have double messages, don't we? On one level, all of God's plans have been fulfilled, and there were no successful opposition. There was no successful opposition by the local residents over against the acknowledgement that there are pockets of resistance that remain, which has led me to suggest earlier that the message of total annihilation may be a stylistic expression, doesn't mean that there was not widespread death on the part of the defenders, the people whom God has said, your time has run out. But absolute literal, the book itself seems to argue against an interpretation that this is absolutely literal. Item C, if so, was this policy necessary? Or we might word it, even if it wasn't total annihilation, maybe that is somewhat figurative or stylistic language, was even a large degree of violence necessary? The comments under C, you can see, have some connection with the earlier comment of the Missio Dei. Israel has shown, unfortunately, a remarkable vulnerability in the face of sexual and spiritual subterfuge conducted by neighboring nations. And I have in mind here what happened in Numbers 25 when, after God repels and almost humorously overturns King Balak's use of the consultant, the prophet Balaam, to bring spiritual forces to harm Israel through a curse, that God defeats easily and humorously, frankly. Balaam winds up blessing Israel instead of cursing. But when it comes down to the ground level, instead of something in the heavenlies, when it comes down to the ground level, then Israel, apparently with great ease and little resistance, succumbs to the seduction by the Moabites. at Baal Peor. In view of that, one can't help but wonder whether God is seeking to provide what we might call an antiseptic environment in Israel, in Canaan, in order for Israel to settle in and reduce the chances of them being spiritually infected. I said a moment ago that we can't help but wonder. Actually, it's fairly plain, isn't it, that this is part of God's concern. He wants to reduce. He keeps telling them, you must not imitate the spirituality of your neighbors. You just can't do that. So he seeks to create a place where there will not be this sort of influence, and removing, bringing to an end the civilization of the prior residents is part of making that possible. Now, one might ask the question, is it only because Israel, part of the Missio Dei, is showing up in the neighborhood that God is bringing such extreme measures against the prior inhabitants of the land? Is it only to create this antiseptic environment for his Israel experiment, as I'm calling it, this attempt to use this nation as his channel for eventual redemption through the Messiah? And that raises the question, are there other times when God brings judgment, but there's no messianic nation, if we can call Israel that way, no messianic delivery nation in the neighborhood? Well, think back to the flood. God did not bring the flood in order to clear out and make room for Israel. He just said, the violence that's going on here, I can't let it continue. As I understand it, too many innocent people are being hurt because everything these people think about is just utterly wicked. I've got to pull the plug on it. The stench is just too strong. Obviously, it's spooled down and will never recover. We could also consider Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not because he had another group of people waiting in the wings, his Israel. At that point, it's just because things were so reprehensible in Sodom and Gomorrah. God said, I can't let this go on. This little corner of the neighborhood is of planet Earth. I just cannot let it continue. It's gone too far in the wrong direction. All this to say, then, we do see from time to time God engages the judgment of nations according to his insight, irrespective of threat to other plans of his, plans such as establishing a nation which will eventually bring the Messiah for the redemption of all of creation. We'll break the video at this point and resume with question D, namely, how was God at work in these events? In the next video.